Can I just ask to start off, how many people know about the RSE? Oh, a good few number. I'm going to tell you more about it anyway. You don't get away that lightly. But for those of you less familiar with us, we were established in 1783 for the advancement of learning and useful knowledge, and that remains our mission to this day. We express it slightly differently in terms of knowledge made useful, but very much about how we bring together different forms of knowledge from across academia, the business, public life, and the creative arts, and how we then deploy it for the benefit of society. And we deliver on that mission in a number of ways. We inspire and support young talent through a programme of research grants and awards, including enterprise fellowships. We provide expertise to policymakers across a whole range of issues, from the Scottish National Investment Bank to the implications of Brexit to subject choice at schools. We build research collaborations and promote Scotland's research base overseas through our collaboration with our sister academies. And indeed, just this morning, we had the president of the All European Academies here speaking to us as part of an event on responding to Brexit. And we do things like this. We engage with the public and with other people on contemporary issues of the day. And what more contemporary and topical issue than our relationship with the environment? Every day there seems to be something in the news, whether it's about the school strikes and wider protests in support of climate change, or tackling climate change, I should say, to international reports on biodiversity loss, if it's about the impact of plastic pollution across the world, or sometimes more localised concerns, whether that's about a golf course being built in Sutherland or about the wind farm in Glen Etive. So it's always very much an issue, the environment and nature, I think, that's at the forefront of public debate. And I think that represents a number of things. One is the public interest that there is in these issues, and also recognition of the critical importance of nature and the environment on the way in which we live our lives and on the choices that we make. And the contested nature of some of these choices that I'm sure we'll get onto later tonight. Now, tonight's event is the 16th annual Peter Wilson Lecture, delivered in partnership with the Scottish Consortium for Rural Research and named after the late Professor Peter Wilson. And I'm very pleased that we're able to be joined tonight by members of his family. So welcome to David and Carol. Peter Wilson served as General Secretary, so one of the trustees of RSE, for a number of years, and in 2002 was awarded the Bicentenary Medal for outstanding service to the Society. And I never knew Peter, but in some ways, reading his biography, he really personified the RSE in that he had a career that spanned both academia and business, and a real interest and commitment to both policy and to practice. And that included instigating the Edinburgh Consortium of Rural Research, which is now the Scottish Consortium. And that's a consortium of organisations and research-based organisations looking at land, freshwater, coastal and marine resources and their uses, including farming, forestry, aquaculture and recreation. So what better topic for tonight's lecture in Peter's name than international leadership for the environment? In terms of the format of tonight's event, in a minute, Francesca will speak for about 25 minutes or so, and then our four panellists will provide some initial reflections on what Francesca has said and maybe the relevance of some of her, what she said for their particular areas of work. And I'll introduce them before they speak. Oh, somebody just testing their phone there. And then we'll open up to a wider conversation with you folks as well. So turning to our speaker for this evening, I'm delighted to welcome Francesca Osowska, Chief Executive of Scottish National Heritage. An economist by training, but don't hold that against her. Francesca worked in a wide range of roles within the civil service, including as Principal Private Secretary to the First Minister and as Director of the Commonwealth Games and Sport, where she had the formidable challenge of making a success of the Commonwealth Games, which of course she did, and for which she was awarded an OBE. After a stint as Director of the Scotland Office, based mainly in Westminster, Francesca took up post as Chief Executive of SNH in October 2017. I had two concerns around tonight. Well, one of them is still outstanding, which is about squeezing such a fascinating and important topic into 90 minutes. My other concern was whether Francesca was wishing to cycle down the aisle up to the podium. As some of you will be aware, Francesca is a committed triathlete and a member of Edinburgh Triathletes and has competed at all distances from sprint to Ironman, and that last bit alone should make you very scared. But also what you may or may not know is that when Francesca took up post, she made a commitment to visiting all of SNH's 30-plus offices, which is a formidable enough challenge in itself until you learn that she also decided to do that by bike. So Francesca is absolutely an emerging leading force for nature in all sorts of ways, and we're delighted to have you speak to us this evening. Thank you, Francesca.
Thank you, Rebecca, for those kind words. I did think about weaving a sort of cycling theme in and coming in my lycra, but I thought maybe that would be a bit too much for everybody, and I'm sure you're glad that I didn't. Thank you also for telling us about Peter Wilson, a remarkable man. I read his biography as well, and really inspirational, and as you say, epitomises what the RSE is about. Thank you to all of you for coming along tonight, particularly given the beautiful Edinburgh weather this evening. If you've had to walk along George Street from a bus stop or from some other sustainable form of transport and got as wet as I did, then you have my sympathies. I hope you dry out in these next few minutes, and there'll be a chance to have some refreshments and chat after this event, which I hope will warm you up. So, to the topic of today, colleagues, this is a critical moment for nature and the environment. As Rebecca says, I've done a number of roles in the Scottish Government and in the UK Government, and I cannot think of a more challenging yet genuinely opportune time for working in this area, in the environment. And Rebecca stole some of my lines. Each week, indeed, practically every day, we are witnessing new global and national commitments for nature and for the environment. Now that brings its challenges. I'm sure we all feel challenged by some of that. But for me, it also brings a high degree of excitement. The theme that I've been asked to address in my talk and our discussion this evening is absolutely spot on. It's brilliantly timed. Thank you to the RSE and SCRR for this inspired choice. Scotland is an international leader in the field of environmentalism. Our sciences, our entrepreneurial acumen, have influenced policies, practices, and the evidence base globally. We are standing on strong shoulders. Now let me paint you a picture of what we could have in Scotland if we don't act by 2030. I want you to imagine an apocalypse. Polluted waters, drained and eroding peatlands, coastal towns and villages deserted in the wake of rising sea level and coastal erosion. Massive areas of forestry afflicted by disease, a dearth of people in rural areas, and no birdsong. All of this is possible, and there are parts of the world today where we can point to where inaction has given rise to one of these or more nightmare landscapes. The idea that the world has only 11 years to get onto a low-carbon pathway to avoid dangerous climate change is all around us in the news. Yes, some of this is alarmist, but there can be no doubt that certain events over the past 2 months have grabbed the public's attention. Rebecca mentioned some of them. Greta Thunberg and the school strikes, David Attenborough's climate facts. The Extinction Rebellion protests are 3 vivid examples. Now, these came on the back of the urgent headline messages from the IPCC Special Report on Global Warming of 1.5 degrees last autumn. Following on from this, in the space of just a week in early May, we received the UK Climate Change Committee's Net Zero report. And then, on Monday the 6th of May, the IPBES Global Assessment of Biodiversity was launched in Paris. The Paris report is arguably the single most significant and far-reaching environmental report ever published. Just reflect on this single global statistic. 1 million species, a tenth of the world's total, may become extinct in our lifetime, on our watch. That is quite heart-stopping. Now, I've got two takes on this. First, let's not quibble over the evidence. The science is irrefutable. But second, it's not too late to act, and that was a key theme of the IPBES report. There is hope. We can turn this around. A nature-rich future is our best insurance against the climate emergency. Now, as the Chief Executive of SNH, our government's nature agency, I welcome the recommendations of the Net Zero report. The Scottish Government's swift action in lodging amendments to the Climate Change Bill so that we can have zero net greenhouse gas emissions by 2045 is fantastic. Cabinet Secretary Rosanna Cunningham deserves special praise for her determined leadership on this and indeed wider environmental stewardship for Scotland. Climate and nature have been in a marriage, if I can call it that, for more than 3 billion years, roughly the duration of the existence of our oldest rocks in Scotland, the Louisian gneiss. Of course, over the many millions of years that have elapsed, there have been mass extinctions of many life forms for entirely natural causes. Major shifts in climate and nature are not unusual in the geological record, but what is unusual is the rate of current shift. It's both unprecedented and phenomenal. In the space of geological seconds, perhaps even milliseconds, we have crashed this marriage. Our actions threaten to disrupt the harmony that has existed over the last 10 to 15,000 years. We are entering a climate which may not be capable of sustaining the planet's billions of people and nature as we know it. Let me explain the wider context. The Global Assessment on Biodiversity, the IPBES report, which I mentioned earlier, identifies 5 main drivers of the loss of biodiversity, the demise of nature. These are the changing use of land and sea, especially for agriculture, forestry, and coastal infrastructure, the direct exploitation of organisms via harvesting, logging, hunting, and fishing, climate change, pollution, and invasive non-native species. Now, as well as a driver in its own right, climate change intensifies and exacerbates all of the other drivers. It will become far more important in the coming decades, especially if the Paris and more recent IPCC targets are not met. It is for these reasons that on the 28th of April, the First Minister declared a climate emergency in Scotland. Inspired by her earlier meeting with young climate change campaigners, Ms. Sturgeon commented, "They are right," and pledged to live up to our responsibility to halt climate change. Now, if you read the IPBES report, it is clear that we have to tackle all 5 of the drivers that I mentioned. We have to do this in the context of a transition to a low-carbon economy. And only in that way can we meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals and secure a stable and vibrant natural world. This, in turn, sustains our high quality of life, and it also sustains nature. So the challenge is considerable, but so are the opportunities. The time frame to achieve all of this is small. Now, time might not be on our side, but what we do have is a remarkable wealth of knowledge and ingenuity on what needs to become. The transformative changes that are needed require us to speak with one voice and to offer many solutions. Internationally, 3 challenges are clear. First, we need to ensure that science, engineering, and technology can respond to meet the net zero targets. Second, we need radical changes in how we manage the land, water, and seas. And third, we need a momentous shift in political and societal attitudes, which in turn will change our individual behaviour and attitudes to the environment and to nature. So let me elaborate on each of these. Science, engineering, and technology developments are moving so swiftly that quite possibly by 2030, we will witness exceptional advances in how all of this helps manage our climate. So far, so good. However, there is the awful possibility that reliance on some of the novel climate-changing endeavours will dissuade public and business efforts from reducing carbon emissions. Part of the problem is that the professions, and I hope I can say this in this room, can compete with one another. What is viewed by one group of scientists as a solution may be paraded by another as a threat. Another problem is complacency. If people believe technology can solve the climate crisis, they might be reluctant to change their ways. Notwithstanding that, some of the potential solutions appear on the face of it to be amazing. For example, recombining carbon from carbon dioxide with hydrogen from water to make hydrocarbons is a variant on carbon capture. This could be an example of the circular economy, turning carbon dioxide emissions back into fuel. Some research is beginning to look at greening our oceans through artificially promoting the growth of plankton to absorb much more carbon dioxide. However, we need to be cautious on such an intervention. Such greening could have catastrophic consequences for nutrient flows in tropical regions. Such is the complexity of how our global oceans and climates connect and function. As ever, we always need to be mindful of unintended consequences. There are yet more trials planned or underway. Some are spraying salt droplets over the ocean to create clouds which reflect sunshine. Not sure about that in the Scottish Highlands and Islands. However, other trials are trying to create clouds over the Arctic and Antarctic polar regions in the hope that they will reflect the sun. These and other geoengineering solutions can seem bewildering, particularly for a layperson like me. And some are currently being researched at the newly established Cambridge Centre for Climate Science. But what's important here is that technology can drive behaviour. We know that climate is not evenly distributed, so these technologies raise a very real question of power. Who do you trust to have their hand on the global climate tiller? The Net Zero report argues that in the UK we need a 50% expansion of renewable energy on land and at sea to meet additional demand for electric vehicles and electric heat. Renewable and other environmentally friendly sources of energy are at the heart of this. New petrol and diesel cars may be history by 2030. Already, half the private cars in Norway are electric, and other countries are close to this statistic. We also need sustainable bioenergy with carbon capture and storage to permit, unavoidable emissions in other parts of the economy. Currently, much of this is untested. I believe we have to be forthright and bold and to push the science, technology and engineering arguments to a plane where we can have inclusive debates which give rise to options for change. Turning to our second challenge, the Net Zero report states that globally, fundamental changes are needed in how we manage our land and seas, and that transformative changes in food production systems are required. Globally, around a quarter of all emissions arise from land use. That's also the case in Scotland. However, in Scotland, where we have so many rural and maritime uses, we have an ethos of meeting challenges and seizing opportunities. The Net Zero report argues that we should be releasing 20% of agricultural land to support emissions reduction through afforestation, peatland restoration, and biomass production. For us in Scotland, this is difficult when so much of our food production is underpinned by rural agriculture and fishing communities, which in places are very fragile. Same goes for timber production, with ambitions to increase the extent of land under forestry with inevitable competition with other uses. All of our land uses must provide multiple benefits. We have the land use strategy to guide us in that. In Scotland, We are now world leaders in peatland restoration. But can we do more to scale up our efforts and keep the carbon locked up in what are some of the world's deepest peat deposits? As part of my travels last year that Rebecca mentioned, I visited the Flow Country. It is truly stunning. I'm delighted to see it is currently being consulted on as a potential World Heritage Site. It is arguably our greatest single asset as Scotland's lung for nature. In northern Scotland, the massive tracts of deep peat with their fantastic open landscapes and some of the highest densities of wading birds recorded anywhere globally are truly treasures for nature. For farming and forestry, we need to think carefully and constructively about the transformations needed in how we use the land to simultaneously reduce emissions, protect and enhance nature, and help build resilience against the inevitable impacts of a changing climate. And we've got some great examples to draw upon. Farming for a Better Scotland provides practical support to benefit farms and helps reduce our impacts on the climate. Run by Scotland's Rural College on behalf of the Scottish Government, this is about adapting to a changing climate as well as managing nature for a better climate. And that takes me to my third point about behavioural and societal changes. We have to work with people so that everyone understands that healthy, diverse nature plays a full and key part in sequestering greenhouse gases and regulating water flows to reduce flood risk. Healthy nature encourages us to be healthy. We want to get out and see nature, enjoy nature, and be inspired by it. I want everybody to have that sense. We want to be outdoors and develop an educational culture of learning outside the classroom. We need to be nurtured by places around us and not cooped up and seeing nature out there, somewhere else, unconnected with us. Connecting people and nature has been my personal mantra since I joined SNH. Too often we see examples of degraded nature. It's a liability. Examples include seas lacking in kelp, forests and seagrass meadows, fragmented and poor condition salt marshes, uplands dominated by eroding peat and heavily grazed with unstable slopes, woods lacking in species and structural diversity, and widespread impoverished soils. Never mind the release of greenhouse gases and exacerbated flood risks. Such landscapes just don't do it for our psyche. They don't make us feel good. All of this points to a very careful rethink on how we collectively work with the land and sea. We need to have one eye on the future and another on the past. We may have been myopic, now we need to be bifocal. Looking ahead, our baselines are shifting like tectonic plates, colliding catastrophically. The shifting states of nature in the last century associated with the first 1 degree temperature rise may not be relevant to this century. There's at least another 0.5 degrees of climate warming already locked into the system as a result of our past emissions. So we have to adapt as we mitigate. All of this is pointing to more empathy, more care, more action, more stewardship. But who acts and in whose interests? A stronger voice for younger people is crucial. Inspirational young people like Greta Thunberg and the School Strikes for Climate, Nature and its Plight are massively influential. Greta has arguably done much more than bringing climate emergency to the fore. She and her colleagues are compelling us to think about far wider and deeper perspectives. They are questioning the power relations that allow changes to happen. Their emphasis on questions about governance is central to the IPBES report recommendations on transformative change. I believe we need to debate these issues in light of emerging evidence. We have to build a consensus around solutions for a more sustainable platform for nature and for us. Transformational change only happens when we have courage and a belief in what's needed. To get there, we need to create the means of working together imaginatively and trustingly. It is increasingly clear that the diversity of people involved in making decisions has to change. For too long, global decisions have been made by narrowly focused people in their own images. That young people have been driving our collective consciousness is great to see. They are the future guardians of our environment. If we don't get it right, they suffer. SNH has been working with a group of young people, our reroute panel. I'm delighted some of them are able to join us tonight, to get their views on future decision-making in nature. How can we all involve our young people in this vital debate? I'd like to look further at the 5 drivers of the IPBES report and how we can work at these in Scotland. There is already a lot of excellent work underway. So the first driver is changing use of the land and sea, especially farming, forestry and fisheries. Each one of us has to eat and drink, but what we choose to consume says a lot about how we care about nature and the climate. Changing the use of the land and seas will need to involve both the production and consumption of food, including fish and wood products. Much of our food relies on domestic wild crop relatives and traditional breeds of livestock, and maintaining these is central to the resilience of our food systems. Over the last few decades, the ways in which we use our seas has changed significantly. For example, with aquaculture and offshore renewables. Marine resources have a crucial role to play in the resilience of food and energy provision, and Scotland is well placed to show a lead here internationally. The second driver in the IPBES report is the direct exploitation of organisms. Key here is how we manage conflicts in wildlife management. Geese, raptors and beavers all come to mind in terms of how they impact on agriculture and game management. In advising on sustainable marine fisheries, we have to continue to work on embedding the ecosystem approach in the management of our seas. It is clear that the sustainability of marine fisheries is dependent on the quality of our natural environment. The third driver is climate change, and as mentioned earlier, it also exacerbates all the other drivers. Peatland restoration protects stored carbon, but beyond that, active and healthy bogs sequester additional greenhouse gases too. They provide other benefits, such as regulating water flows to reduce flood risk and enhancing the species and habitat interests. Our pioneering work in Scotland on blue carbon in our coasts and seas, such as the management of kelp forests, can help to sequester carbon as well as absorbing wave energy and reducing coastal flood risk. Planting native trees by rivers can also reduce flood risk and enhance freshwater biodiversity, not least through providing shade and cooling in warm weather. The Scottish Government's award-winning Dynamic Coast, led by SNH and delivered by the University of Glasgow and others, is a fantastic partnership project. It has assessed coastal changes in infrastructure and how these will respond to sea level rise and flood frequency. The fourth driver is pollution. We are working closely with colleagues on a range of issues, including acid deposition on sensitive upland habitats. Work in this area will go prominently, not least as research shows just how harmful air pollution is to us all. We are rightly beginning to look very closely at nitrogen emissions, and there are many impacts on people and nature. There is much we can do here already, given the science readily available. And finally, invasive non-native species, INS. In addition to our statutory roles, we are leading the Scottish Invasive Species Initiative, which is an exciting and ambitious 4-year partnership project set up to tackle INS alongside rivers and watercourses in northern Scotland. Threats from INS are increasing with the growth in international trade and travel. INS are the single biggest threat to nature in our protected areas. So we are involved in many projects to combat this. For example, we are controlling toxic giant hogweed in the lower Wick River site of special scientific interest in Caithness, and we're getting rid of Japanese knotweed from the Ballantrae Shingle Beach SSSI in South Ayrshire. These are 2 examples of scores of locally vital projects underpinned by robust biosecurity principles and practice. So let's look ahead. At the end of next year, the Conference of Parties on the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD, will be held in Kunming in China. This will be the international stage at which targets and actions will be set out for the next decade. These will build on the IPBES report that I've mentioned. In Scotland, we have a great range of projects underway, as I've outlined, and as set out in Scotland's Biodiversity, a route map to 2020. Many of them have already hit their targets and involved a massive effort by agencies, NGOs, local communities, land managers, volunteers. There's a wealth of collaborations. A good number of these are supported by EU and National Lottery Heritage Funds, two vital funding streams. Collectively, these projects are working towards delivering the HE 2020 targets of the CBD. An improved evidence base incorporating innovations in satellite and other forms of remote sensing and huge support from citizen science will transform our effectiveness by 2030. Species tracking and alerts, including for INS, means that we can make rapid responses to danger. Near real-time species habitat analysis and modelling and rapid assessment of conservation status will enable us to be much better at taking action. We are working on the development of a comprehensive habitat map for Scotland's land and seas, which will reduce decision times on development proposals. A review of the biological recording infrastructure in Scotland was published by the Scottish Biodiversity Information Forum last autumn. This is the most comprehensive appraisal of citizen science, wildlife recording, and data management to date. We are advising government on how this might be taken forward. Our family of citizen scientists is, on the basis of our population, one of the largest and certainly the best in the world. You name a group of animals, plants, or other organisms, and we have about 90,000 species in Scotland, and you can be sure we have a group reporting on them. And this knowledge doesn't just benefit Scotland. We make a vital contribution to global knowledge. Of course, this chimes with RSE's own strapline, knowledge made useful. So exciting times ahead. But let me leave you with 4 key areas where I feel we need to act, and then one final thought. For our food production, we need to consider pathways to sustainable food systems which build on existing land use and marine planning, and which shift to sustainable management of both supplier-producer and the demand-consumer sides of food systems. Well-structured regulations, incentives, and subsidies are needed. And these have to operate at landscape and seascape scales. We can all act now by cutting down the use of single-use plastics and drastically reducing our food waste. For cities, towns, and villages, integrated city-specific and landscape-level planning for nature will give us sustainable and equitable places in which to live and work. This will make a significant contribution to coping with the climate emergency. Now, we can all act now through using more sustainable forms of transport. As a cyclist, you'd expect me to say this. For the economy, achieving a sustainable basis involves fundamentally reforming our economic and financial systems. We need to tackle poverty and inequality as vital parts of sustainability, aims that are central to the Scottish Government's National Performance Framework. Our investment in nature is beginning to be recognised in national accounts, and we need to make sure that organisations, businesses, communities, and individuals make far more of nature's benefits. We can act now by ensuring that nature is valued for its own existence, as well as for the huge public benefits that it provides. For a nature-rich Scotland, we need to operate at landscape scale, involving far greater involvement and investment in local communities. in both urban and rural settings. There is a growing appetite for this investment culturally and socially, and we can act now through encouraging this investment enthusiastically. Colleagues, I've taken you through international and national work to ensure that we all have a nature-rich future, that our young people have a nature-rich future. I believe that this is the best insurance against our climate emergency. Nature has an essential role to play in how we reduce emissions and how we adapt to changes into which we are already locked. By working with nature, we can help moderate the changing climate. And through a more stable climate, we can sustain a far healthier and more resilient environment. If we achieve all of this, and potentially more, Scotland will be an even greater international leader for the environment. If we do what we've always done, we'll just get what we've always got. We simply cannot afford to do that. We do stand on strong shoulders, but now we must work for generations to come. Our collective ambition is clear. This is what nature needs. This is what Scotland needs. Ask not what nature can do for you. Ask what you can do for nature. That is how we will, collectively, be international leaders for the environment. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Francesca, and what a tour de force of the issues, and not just actually an explanation of the issues, but actually thinking about what we can do about them. We're now going to be joined by our panellists, if I could ask them to join us on the stage. Louise Macdonald, Colin Campbell, Mike Robertson and Martin Valenti. I'll say a little bit more about them each before they speak. And they're going to provide some initial reflections on what Francesca has said and perhaps where it connects most particularly with their work. And I'm going to start, once focus settled, if I may, with Louise Macdonald at the end here. I'm sure Louise is very well known to many of you. Louise is Chief Executive of Young Scot and has done a fantastic job in actually getting the voices of young people heard and influencing policy and practice. Amongst many key roles, Louise is Chair of the First Minister's National Advisory Council for Women and Girls. And Louise is also the first woman to serve as President of the European Youth Card Association, and in 2016 was recognised by the Institute of Directors as a UK, not just Scotland, but as the UK's Third Sector Director of the Year. So Louise, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Rebecca, and good evening everyone. How are we? Well, okay, I believe there's people in other rooms as well, so hello to those that are in other rooms. Can you hear me okay? Is that all right in terms of that? So thank you for that, and huge thanks to you, Francesca, for that excellent speech, and delighted to be part of the response to that. I have to say that young people, as was highlighted here, have been shouting about this for a long time, and I would suggest that not all of us have been listening. And this is about power, again, as Francesca says, literally and literally. Who has it, who holds on to it, and why? Who cedes it, who gives it away? Greta Thunberg has in Greece indeed sort of challenged those in power, but so have young people closer to home. And as Francesca said, SNH has worked with Young Scot and on a reroute project since 2015. And I do want to publicly pay tribute to the work that you've done as one of the very first public bodies in Scotland to commit to involving young people at the very highest levels of strategy and decision making using a co-design model. And from that initial research, when Reroute was founded, the young people did some baseline work, and they found that 76% of young people in Scotland, aged 11 to 26, said nature was important to them. Remember, this is nearly 5 years ago. And 87% were saying we all had to do more to protect the environment. There's now been 2 cohorts of the Reroute panel working with SNH, and as was mentioned, we have representatives of both with us this evening, so please do get the chance, if you can, to speak to them later. And they've worked on issues ranging from scrutinising the progress of Scotland's biodiversity strategy, working with the executive team at SNH on futures thinking, planning and delivering the Scottish Parliament's biggest ever reception to mark the Year of Young People. They've sourced funding, they've given out thousands of trees and seeds, they've to community groups, they've given away funding, they created their own grants panel, the Future Roots Fund. These examples that they've set, coupled with the catalyst of the Year of Young People 2018 last year, I think acted as a spark of inspiration and showing the art of the possible for other organisations that were working with nature, both public bodies and third sector across Scotland. And I'm pretty sure that seeing what Reroute was doing with SNH has led to several organisations being that bit braver and avoiding the pitfalls of tokenism in terms of how they involve young people than they might have been. And I'd also want to acknowledge the work that's been done by the 2050 Young Climate Leaders group, which Martin and I played a part in incubating. Young Scot actually led the initial co-design work for that group. And I'm going to admit this here, although I might get in trouble, but it was mainly to provide the 2020 climate group at that time with an answer, or that the answer to this growing climate emergency did not lie with yet another schools pack or poster competition. And at that point, we spoke to young people about what they wanted adult leaders to do about climate change. And at that point, those young people were angry. They were angry then, and they were angry because they told us that they'd been learning about this stuff since they were in primary school. This stuff's been known since they were in primary school, and yet adults had still done nothing. So this has been brewing for a while. But Greta Thunberg, do you know what? She's only been striking for 40 weeks. In less than a year, that girl has changed the world. And she's a shining example of what happens when you've got someone who's an expert of their own experience calling to account those in power. And as adults, we are being challenged by children and young people unflinchingly about what we should have, how we've allowed this to happen, as was said, on our watch. And it should make us uncomfortable, all of us, wherever we are on the spectrum of being involved in this work. But I do agree with Francesca, it's not too late to act. She talked about tectonic plates colliding catastrophically. I love that quote. But I also have a sense of plates moving in terms of the hope that's being generated by young people. As the amazing US Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has said, you can't wait for hope. You have to be hope. Now, I'm really lucky because I get to work with young people every single day in my job, and every single day they give me hope, and every single day they make me braver as a leader. And I'd ask everyone in the room to do the same. Recognise that young people are not citizens of the future. They're not citizens in waiting, having some existential crisis waiting to emerge. They're here right now. They're citizens now. And if we work with them, we will make the difference that we seek. And I'd also say, and a slight kind of plea, this is not about trying to harness the power of young people. This is about unleashing it. Finally, if you haven't revisited Silent Spring by the amazing US marine biologist, nature writer Rachel Carson recently, I would recommend you find a quiet spot under a tree and do so. In 1962, terminally ill, Rachel Carson delivered the commencement speech at Scripps College in California. And in many ways, that speech was her handing on the baton to fight for nature to the next generation. At that speech, she said, "The stream of time moves forward and mankind moves with it. Your generation must come to terms with the environment. You must face realities of instead of taking refuge in ignorance and in evasion of truth. Yours is a grave and sobering responsibility, but is also a shining opportunity. You go out into a world where mankind is challenged as it has never been challenged before, to prove its maturity and its mastery, not of nature, but of itself. Therein lies our hope and our destiny. I do wonder if it seems like Rachel Carson's baton skipped a couple of generations, but I don't think young people are going to let it drop this time, and neither should we. Thank you.
So we've got a panellist that cuts across academia, the third sector, and the public sector. And our next speaker is also from a charity. Mike Robertson is Chief Executive of the Royal Scottish Geographical Society and a board member of a number of charities, including Perth City Development and Transform Scotland. Mike also helped found Stop Climate Chaos Scotland, and I think you're still a trustee, Mike. So over to you.
Thank you very much. I thought I'd start with a story, actually. When I was chair of Stop Climate Chaos, I had a meeting with a cabinet secretary, and it was a last-ditch attempt to persuade him to put a 42% target in the 2009 Act. And we're having a long conversation, and he stopped me and he said, actually, what you need to understand is this is about how you think. He said, this is about whether you think the glass is half full or half empty. And for once, I didn't come up with a funny line 3 days later. I managed to come up with it at the moment. And I said, aye, but either way, you're talking about half a glass. I just want you to fill the glass up. The thing is, the time for rhetoric is over. Absolutely, now we require action. However, on one note, he was absolutely correct. It does require that we think differently. And that's really what I wanted to sort of reflect on based on Francesca's speech. So, firstly, I do worry that the way we talk about nature sometimes is as something other, something else, something separate, and it absolutely isn't. And we really need to think about the lexicon and the language that we use around this. I sometimes think the phrase we should be using is the planet we rely on and everything that lives on it. And then we might understand the sort of centrality of it to our lives. I'm a big believer that we need to work more collaboratively, more cross-sectorally, and break down silos. We don't have as many generalists as we perhaps could have. We've known the science on climate change for 40 years. If the solution was simply to understand the science, we would have solved it years ago. It needs much more cross-disciplinary, joined-up thinking, more crossover into applied solutions, communication, policy, and action, and we need to value all of those things. Having been working in the environment sector, I would argue that by any measure, we have been losing the war. And we absolutely need to use this latest wave of concern to generate the political space and momentum to truly make some gains. But we do need to remain optimistic. I don't believe you can lead if you are not optimistic. Optimism comes from believing that we can do better. It comes from understanding the solutions and enacting them and helping to make them happen. That, for me, is the greatest challenge. We need to take responsibility. We have, as a society, waited 40 years for David Attenborough and Greta Thunberg to tell us there's a problem. And they have highlighted this problem and also the responsibility that we have for next generations. I wrote a blog piece recently about the fact that every November we stop and consider the contribution that our forebears made and the sacrifice that they gave to us. And I wonder what our children and grandchildren will stop and remember us for in a similar period of time. We need to care about more than just money. Deep down, we know that nature matters. We're still destroying it. We're still increasing emissions. Increasingly, the environment feels under pressure to explain its economic value because it just feels like nobody's really listening otherwise. But since this is always secondary, it's always on the back foot. We need to challenge every sector of society to prove its environmental good, not just its economic impact. And for that, we need to reappraise value. We count sometimes the wrong things. GDP is only a bit of money. Money is only a bit of the economy. Economy is only a bit of society. And society is only a bit of the environment. We count GDP, but we don't count the damage that it does. And yet the damage we have done to prop up our Victorian obsession with economic-only growth is immense. We need the resources to kickstart this change. according to both the Stern report and the UKCC report, the Net Zero report reconfirmed this. We can make these changes with around 1 to 2% of GDP at the moment, and if we start to take action. Some of the measures that we want to see are cost neutral and some are cost beneficial, so it's not all about money, but we do need to get this started seriously. Why don't we use the new wave of renewable investment to create a sovereign wealth fund out of renewables instead of frittering it all away on pension breaks and things? We need to see the opportunity in leadership. Up until the 1980s, climate change was the accidental consequence of being unsustainable. But since the 1980s, it's been an active choice. Ultimately, then, leadership requires choosing a different and a better, more rounded path to the future, a path that considers its impact and values nature. Scotland is leading the world in some arenas in science, innovation and industry, and we are developing a global reputation for leadership around climate change. This necessary move to a zero-carbon society is a global momentum, and we have a real opportunity to really grasp this and lead. Edinburgh was the seat of the last Enlightenment, the age of reason. We need a new Enlightenment, an age of solutions. And we also, I think, need everyone to understand the key solutions and their role. And I don't mean kids, I mean managers. Governments have set some clear targets, but they could do a lot more. However, they don't have the tools and levers to deliver on even half the targets. These are not government targets anyway, they're society's targets, and everyone is going to have to help deliver them. That requires every one of us to step up, every one of us to understand the key critical solutions, and every one of us to take some leadership in our own spheres of work and influence. We all believe our kids need to understand and care for the environment, but when we grow up, we seem to expect them to forget about it and leave it behind. Why do we think our responsibility to the environment ends when we get a job? Why do we think it's essential for kids to understand, but irrelevant for adults? We seem to have delegated our responsibility to children, but children don't have the authority or power to bring about change. We don't have time for that. We, you and me, need to get on with it. Their priority is to call us out for not doing enough. The school climate strikes have done exactly that. One of my favourites is, if you won't act like adults, we will. But I sometimes think we need to act more like kids. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. We've heard from Francesca about the vital importance of science and evidence in underpinning both our understanding of the problems and indeed our understanding of the solutions. And we're really, really fortunate in Scotland that we have some great research institutes and researchers working, including the Scotland's Rural College and the James Hutton Institute. So I'm delighted that we've got with us tonight Colin Campbell, who's the Chief Executive of the James Hutton Institute and a world-leading researcher on soil health. Written an awful lot about sewage sludge, I see, so if you want to know more about that, ask him later. Colin sits on the Scottish Government's Forum for Natural Capital and has acted as an expert and participant in many EU and UK government workshops addressing issues around the sustainable use of soils. So very pleased to have you, Colin.
Thank you. Yeah, so thank you, Rebecca. Now, you did promise me I would get to speak about soils, and I will speak about soils in a minute. But if I could reflect on the lecture and also the comments from the panellists, which I've really enjoyed, I would thoroughly agree about linking biodiversity crisis with the climate crisis. They are the same issue, and the biodiversity crisis, if it's tackled, will tackle the climate change crisis, and if we tackle the climate change crisis, we'll tackle the biodiversity crisis. So thoroughly agree with that. And the United Nations have declared a decade of restoration, and there's something like 13 to 26 gigatons of carbon could be sequestered if we restore 350 million hectares of land across the world. That tells you how linked these two crises are. So I thoroughly agree with that point made in the lecture. I'd also like to reflect particularly on Louise's comments about young people, and it's very salutary because I'm not young anymore. And I've been working on climate change for a very long time, I think, in terms of my scientific career as a researcher. And actually, I've been quite surprised by what's happened, and I found it quite salutary and a bit of a wake-up call as well. And I thought I was doing something about it, and actually I'm thinking maybe I'm not doing enough about it. And I'm questioning whether we really are leading the world. And Scotland, I think, has led the world initially in setting targets. And I think Scotland has led the world with some very progressive policies. And I would quote the land use strategy, which was born from the Climate Change Act. That is a very progressive strategy. It's arguably needs reinvigorated, and it's not fully implemented. But it is still, I think, the only land use strategy in the world that I'm aware of. And it actually provides a very useful framework for implementing all the things we're talking about in terms of climate crisis and biodiversity crisis. So, but we then have to challenge ourselves about whether we really are doing enough, because the sector that I work in terms of land and agriculture, actually nothing's really changed in the last couple of decades. We are not actually reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. So we actually do need to think about new imaginative ways of doing that. And all the research that we do is going to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, but work on nitrogen fertilisers, new breeds of livestock, new breeds of crops, reducing disease. All these things will make a difference, but actually they're just incremental. They're not going to make the transformational change that we really, really need. And we really have to face up to the fact that if we want the transformational change, we're going to have to change our land use. We're going to have to change where we grow our food. We're going to have to change what we use that land for. It's not necessarily going to get used for food production. It could be that we have to plan and manage it for carbon sequestration, plan and manage it for biodiversity. So we have to challenge ourselves about whether we're actually thinking enough about what we're doing with our land. So the great thing that everybody always talks about in land is the pressure on livestock. And livestock are terrible greenhouse gas emissions. Actually, in Scotland, we're incredibly efficient. But it's making it very inconvenient for us because we're good at growing grass. And we can't think about anything else to feed that grass to other than our livestock. But actually, there's lots of things you can feed grass to. You can feed it to a biogas digester. You can make methane. If you make methane, you can make hydrogen fuel. If you're growing grass, you can feed it to insects. If you've got insect protein, you can feed it to fish. You can feed it to poultry. So we maybe need to think a bit more imaginative about what we're actually using our land for. Now, don't please run out and start a new business based on anything I've just said. But at the same time, I'm trying to say we need to challenge ourselves as scientists. We need to reimagine the way we do things. Now, a great example of how we're doing that at the James Hutton Institute is about talking about vertical indoor farming. And the harsh reality of the future is that actually climate change has already happened and will happen no matter what we do. And the weather's going to get a lot more variable, and it's going to be a lot more difficult to grow food in any way that we choose to do it. So you look at Scotland, one of our greatest natural assets is the water we get. Now I can tell you we get roughly 160 billion cubic metres of rainfall in some years. Now don't be depressed, remember yesterday's water is tomorrow's whiskey. But at the same time, some years we only get 100 billion cubic metres of rain. And last year we did have a drought. And it was a big problem for many farmers. Scotland was slightly better off in its soils. And do you know why? Because generally we've got more organic matter, more carbon in our soils. So we retained more water. But our soils are not at their full soil carbon content, our agricultural soils. So we did a calculation using the National Soils Database. And if all of our agricultural soils were at their maximum carbon that they can achieve, we would have been the equivalent of 3 days extra rainfall last year. So the link between climate change and the future resilience of our food production systems is a really close one. And everything we do to combat climate change is going to help us to adapt to it. It's also going to help the other ecosystem services like water retention. And of course soils, and I was very interested, you said there was 60,000 species in Scotland? 90,000 species in Scotland, and Rob Brooker's shaking his head here because he knows what I'm going to say. Most of the biodiversity on the planet is in soils, and it's nobody ever talks about it, and very few people are measuring it. Well, we are actually, but nobody's measuring it as a citizen scientist. And we need to protect that biodiversity because that actually feeds through the food chain. So by increasing the organic carbon of our soils, we're also feeding the food chain. And biodiversity on farmlands and other land is going down. But if you're feeding the soil to restore carbon and it's also retaining water, it's also feeding that food chain and it's helping to restore biodiversity. So we need a completely new joined up way of thinking about things and go for these win-wins because they're going to help solve these different problems. So I think we need to think again and reflect on what we're doing, be more imaginative and show leadership in ideas as well as in policy.
Thanks so much, Colin. So Colin ended there with sort of joining up our ways of thinking, and other panellists have also already talked about joining up our ways of working and collaboration. And our final panellist tonight is Martin Valenti, who's Head of Strategic Initiatives at the Scottish Environment Protection Agency and sits on the boards of Scotland's Town Partnerships and Edinburgh Science. I think we can describe Martin as a champion for collaborative working, and he co-founded the 2020 Climate Group and the 2050 Young Leaders Climate Group, and it's going to be our last speaker today.
Well, thank you, everyone. I can't tell you how nerve-wracking it is sitting looking at all your faces, knowing everyone in this room smarter than me. And then, to add to that, I'm joined on this panel by every hero I've ever imagined, so what could possibly go wrong? So Colin said something very interesting. Everyone has, but Colin's point about the interrelationship. So the challenges of climate change are interrelated. So it stands to reason that the solutions are interrelated, yet for some reason in Scotland, this is a slightly negative part, as we work fragmented, we work in silos. Here is my solution to this, here's my piece of the jigsaw, here's my piece of the jigsaw, here's my piece of the jigsaw. That doesn't make any sense to me. So, no one organisation or sector is going to actually crack this net zero if they approach it from a fragmented space. So we need to actually agree here and now, today, 30th of May, in the RSE, that as of tomorrow, there is no such thing as fragmentation. We have to be aligned, we have to be collaborative, we have to work together. Otherwise, we're going to have to accept we're going to fail spectacularly. And it will not just be Greta Thunberg we'll be hiding from, it's Mother Nature and your grandchildren. So that's something to think about. Francesca is 3 actions. I had to write this down. This is the one that resonates most with me. We have to transform behaviours, attitudes to the environment and nature with a groundswell shift in political and societal attitudes. So the first attitude I think we need to shift is yours. Because we're wonderful in this country at saying somebody should do something about that. Well, that's you. So that's the first point. And the second point is, don't expect this to be done by someone else or some golden bullet or some technological solution at some point in the future, or let's blame it on Louise's young people who are going to bail us out of this problem. We have to work together now. There is no tomorrow. Greta Thunberg reminds us that we have to act like the house is on fire. So just kind of keep that in your mind for a moment. So how do we then align society? So Christiana Figueres is another hero of mine who's not here, who was the lady who got the Paris Climate Change Agreement. And let me just remind you how she got that. Up until then, there had been 20 conventional parties, all failed. All run by men, all failed. All predicated on what do we have to lose from tackling climate change? All failed. Christiana goes to Paris, and I don't know if it was something about Paris, and the conversations were about what do we have to gain by tackling climate change? Success. People left the room motivated and ready to do something quite transformative. She also speaks about outrage and optimism. So we've got the outrage from Greta saying, shame on you and your house. But we've got the optimism in Chris Stark, a guy who used to be the Director of Energy and Climate Change here, and it's sad we've lost him, but we've gained him because he's now the Chief Exec of the Committee on Climate Change, who says there is hope. Francesca mentioned hope. Hope is the thing that we don't wait on, it's the thing that we create right now. So I'm going to tell you about what transformation means for me. Is the way we work on climate change needs to change now from being fragmented to aligned, from can't to can do, from problem-focused to opportunity-focused, because that's the only way we're going to actually manage to make this thing work. And I'll give you one very quick example about something that I'm outraged about, that then I led towards being optimistic about, was I looked at, and don't tell anyone from government if they're here, or local authorities, in fact, just keep it to yourselves. Let's have a tweet amnesty for 5 minutes, is that Scotland for 30 years has been trying to tackle vacant and derelict land. Well, guess what? For 30 years, it's still there. And if we deal with it at the same pace we're dealing with it, it'll still be there in 78 years. Now, I don't know what your definition of success is, but let's agree it's not that. So if we continue to work fragmented and siloed, but really, really diligently hard and doing the very best we can, we're going to fail. Fact. So what we have to do is think about what's the optimistic way of dealing with that. Well, here's what it is. I called together a group of people, and this is something we do brilliantly in Scotland. and we left our guns and holsters at the door, and no one was allowed to leave the room until we agreed there was a better way for dealing with vacant derelict land. We could transform these sites for commerce and for communities. We can remove the barriers, we can create incentives, and that all comes from having conversations. But it's really important that when you get to the end of the conversation, you collaborate and move forward. You don't leave the room going, that was a great meeting. We've all done that. So, a few hours ago, and there's a few people in the room, Simon Cage is here from Edinburgh Science. Put your hand up, Simon, if you're about, there he is. We both co-chaired, as is the nature of my world, a group with about 30 chief executives and business leaders, literally along the road in the Edinburgh Centre for Carbon Innovation. The topic was, how do we collaborate to help Scotland not just stumble towards, accidentally net zero, but how do we see it as a massive opportunity? And how do we collaborate, and how do we push everything out the way? Because that's all that really matters. The house is on fire, remember? We haven't got time to wait to figure out what type of emergency, we just have to act, and we have to act now. But the only way, and I can't stress this enough, you can go back to tweeting now, the only way we will succeed is if we are willing to give up our siloed mentality, our disciplined approach, and be a bit bold, a bit creative, and a bit disruptive. In fact, I'm going to finish with that, for those who have watched Game of Thrones, anyone? A couple of people in the room, okay? But, and I won't do a spoiler, so don't worry, but Jon Snow, who people say I look alike, I'm joking. I really am joking. Louise can see it, but that's vodka. But Jon Snow said the only way we're going to defeat this massive big problem is if we collaborate, because if we work on our own, we're finished. So last message is no more conversations, it's time to collaborate at pace, with purpose, right now. Thank you.
No more conversations, but time for a few questions before we finish tonight. We've got about 15 minutes for questions. What I'm going to do is take a couple at a time, so we can try and get through a few. I'm not going to ask all panellists to answer all questions. I'll just see who wants to answer them. We haven't got a huge amount of time, but we will be having an opportunity afterwards to continue the conversations. But the conversations is a prelude to action, Martin, just to make sure that I have heard you. Okay, so a couple of questions. A gentleman there and a lady right down at the front.
Thank you, Francesca, and all of the eminent panel. I'm Paul Gill, Director of Environmentally Sustainable Systems. From our work across all 5 of the drivers of biodiversity loss, which Francesca identified, and the immensely privileged view I was inspired by as a front steward at the Scottish Youth Climate Action March last Friday, I see 2 preeminent imperatives. 1, we need to collaborate in the fashion Martin and Mike have identified in more interdisciplinary action, especially between, as Francesca dubbed it, the professions. Led by generalists who understand all of the issues and the tensions and synergies between them. And secondly, we must step up as the first generation, that inspired by Rachel Carson, that has the responsibility and capacity to not only stop biodiversity loss and climate change, but start reversing both. I would greatly value Francesca and the panel's views upon these 2 imperatives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we'll just take this question down here as well.
Hello, my name is Naomi and I'm a representative of the 2050 Climate Group. Thank you very much for all of your brief explanations, and I don't think anyone in the room could ignore the emphasis that was put on the importance of young people. And I say this with a cheeky smile on my face. Mike, you said that no one is listening and that we seem to stop thinking about our responsibility when we get a job to nature and the environment. I would disagree with that. Young people are listening, and we all have full-time jobs in the 2050 Climate Group, and yet we are still volunteering every evening and doing really rather a lot. So my question is, how do we get invited to your panels? How do we sit up there with you, alongside you, and be respected and respectful in the way that you have all spoken of so eloquently this evening.
Mike, do you perhaps want to take that question first, and maybe Louise will want to chip in, and then we'll come to Francesca to answer those first questions.
And I can swap seats with you if you like. Yeah? You could.
You can have it.
Well, in the spirit of collaborative thinking, I think you should answer the first question.
I mean.
No, I mean, should we involve young people? Of course we should. And actually, I think all of us have made great efforts to do that, although I'm sure we could all do more. My comment is based on experience, and I've seen many, many stories, and I hope, and I'm delighted that actually we seem to have a generation that aren't prepared to let go of some of that. But certainly, when I started work, I remember I've worked for a large multinational and had a great interest in the environment because I'd been brought up to enjoy nature and be part of nature, and it was very much expected that you sort of left it at the door. And in fact, the story I'm going to tell you very quickly is a wonderful lady who ran a shortbread company and started work age of 14, and she retired age 64, and she came to me and said, I want to do something, positive. And the only thing she could remember, other than working really hard for 50 years, was her childhood when she sort of skipped daintily through pine trees and tripped over capercaillie. And I had to inform her that there weren't that many capercaillie left. But she realised her thing was to go back to her childhood and try and reimagine nature, and she's tried to rebuild a forest and bring capercaillie back. But it really struck me that for that period of work, she had parked that interest as if it had nothing to do with her career, and had only visited it on retirement in a sort of throwback to childhood. And that isn't helping anybody. We really need to just make it more integrated in the way that we think and the way that we work. So I'm delighted your generation is doing it, and power to your elbow over the climate strikes too. So,
Louise, is there anything you want to add? Is that your experience?
I mean, clearly I work for a youth organisation, and so I'll have to say though, more and more, I think personally my job is, actually what we've just demonstrated, is getting out the way, creating space and then getting out the way. So I think if my a bit of a message for this audience might be that, Naomi, is think how you can create space for young people to come in and be heard, but then just kind of get out of the way. And that was my kind of point about ceding power. The other, quickly, just I'm aware of time, but there's one point that I would want to kind of make on that. And again, it's a challenge to those that work with kind of nature, and very taken with Francesca's point about, that whole kind of connecting people in nature. One of the things that I have witnessed is that we are incredibly generous in supporting small children to be in nature and love nature. We spend a lot of time with really, really little ones about awe in nature and how amazing it is and how nurturing it is and how powerful it is and how good it is for them. We don't do that with teenagers. When it comes to teenagers, we tell them they don't belong. We tell them you either have to conquer nature, you have to survive it, you have to beat it. That's their interaction with nature, or that they're not welcome. And I think there is something that we have to accept about that, about how we kind of miss the opportunity to build on that connection that we make with nature with little ones into those that are kind of teenagers, and the opportunity to then give them the chance to become the stewards and have that kind of sense of it being a place for them, this sense of nature being other for far too many teenagers. And that's particularly the case in terms of diverse communities and those who suffer kind of greater inequalities. We have a really, really serious issue with some young people who just get no access to nature whatsoever, particularly teenagers. And I think if we paid attention to that, we would then have more young people in these spaces also.
And I think there are some schemes beginning to do that, but very early. I mean, I know the Ramblers, for example, are starting to do that and trying to get more young people in that sort of age group out, and then it becomes part of the culture and part of the way you live your lives. Francesca, Paul's questions around, I think, interdisciplinarity and also how we can reverse some of the more negative changes that have already been begun.
Yeah, but if I could just, at the risk of kind of hogging this particular subject, can I just reflect on the young people element, because as you've heard, we set up a panel, we called it Reroute, to have a conversation with young people on what they wanted in terms of how to be involved in decision making around nature. And they presented us with a report, and that was fantastic, and we had recommendations, and we said we're going to implement these recommendations. And then I rocked up at Louise's office a little while after this, and I said, you know, look, aren't we great? And Louise kind of, you know, in a typical diplomatic fashion went, well, yeah, that was great. I guess that was great. But actually, what you really need to do, and she's used the phrase a couple of times this evening, what you really need to do is you need to think about how you seed power in your organisation to young people. Just putting them in the Reroute box. Yeah, you've done more than other organisations, but actually not good enough. And she didn't quite say it like that. But there was a message there. So we've worked, and, you know, S&H in terms of an organisation, most of the people, apart from me, have 3 degrees. You know, if you're working in S&H, you're massively qualified. So you're starting work, you know, in your 30s. So our concept of young people might be slightly different to other organisations, but we've set up a way to involve both kind of our Reroute members and our young people in the decision making in our organisation, being part of our board discussions, and that seeding power. I mean, that's scary till you've done it.
Shouldn't be scary. Oh, no.
Shouldn't be scary. No.
We can be trusted.
Oh,
very much.
absolutely. So how you get into, you know, so how do you get into that kind of into S&H boardroom? We have our chair with us today. How do you get Mike kind of, you know, pointing at you and saying, so what do you think? You keep doing what you're doing, you become part of that network. And more organisations will do that. In terms of interdisciplinary issues and stepping up, I mean, yes and yes. I mean, you know,
We can stop there then.
yeah, absolutely. But I'll just say one thing on the sort of, well, I'll say 2 things. One on interdisciplinary. There's so many different disciplines which can help us. You know, in the past, I've worked with behavioural scientists, planners, architects. I think our, you know, behavioural science, in particular, when we're talking about societal attitudes, are they at our table, really? Planners and architects, I went on a visit earlier this week to a park that had just been created near Castlemilk. And it had been a golf course, fenced off, and that golf course had, you know, gone under. The council had basically locked it up, and it then kind of suffered lots of social degradation issues, came undone, vandalised, and the council went, actually, no. They could have just built the fence higher, but they said, no, actually there's an asset here and we want to use it for the community. And it was only by involving the different disciplines, you know, the planners, getting the community involved, that actually what we saw, and after only 6 months' work, a park that was being used by the community, and we saw that, you know, we were there and there were people running, people walking their dogs in quite a kind of deprived part of Glasgow, and we spoke to one of them, and, you know, I wondered if our comms manager had sort of planted this person as they told me how brilliant this resource was for the community. So yes, and stepping up. So there's stepping up organisationally, and S&H, I want us to step up, we have to respond, but there's stepping up individually, and how many people have done the thing which is, oh yeah, you know, I do all of that. Yeah, I recycle. Yeah, I'm pretty good. Well, really? What are you doing about your food waste? What are you doing about kind of some of your transport choices? And I think we can all individually challenge ourselves and in that way step up.
I'm going to take 2 quick questions, please, and then I'll take 2 succinct answers. You can take this one. There's a Lady just here and just in the sort of middle towards the back in the green, woman.
Hi, my name's Pat Monaghan from Glasgow University. I wanted to make 2 quick points. I wanted to congratulate Francesca, particularly on her last statement in her talk, which was ask not what nature does for you, but what you can do for nature. To some extent, that flies in the face of the sentiment that's being encouraged in nature conservation, which is to view nature as something in our service and think only of what it provides for us. The second quick point I wanted to make is a bit of an elephant in the room about which the international community is rather silent, which is human population growth. We have too many people, and what can we do about it?
Thank you much. And the lady in the green.
Courtney Payton from Crown Estate Scotland. I'm going to go back to the point that we've touched on briefly about silos, because I think it's really very important. And it's something we've been talking about for a long time. We've talked about systems thinking and sustainability and climate change since the 70s, since Donatella Meadows was talking about it. I remember being at a reception in this building about 12 years ago, and several people who were here and I were standing there talking with Richard Wakeford, who was the DG for Environment at the time, about sustainability and systems thinking and breaking down these silos governmentally and how this could work. And I remember him using materials that we'd shared with him in various presentations and speeches, both within cabinet and outside. But things haven't changed. So what I would really like to know from each of you is, we are all, well, we're not all, many of us are professionals, but we all have many elements to our lives. We have jobs, we have colleagues, we have our neighbors, we have our families, we have our friends. What can we practically do tomorrow to go and start breaking down the silos in our own lives? Because unless we all start doing it, it doesn't matter what senior official says this is a good thing to do, it's not going to make the slightest bit of difference.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm afraid there isn't time for every panellist to respond to that, but I might just come to Martin first of all.
So I've got this strategy, proceed until apprehended. Who's stopping you speaking to people? I mean, seriously, so I don't, my boss isn't here so I can get away with it, but I've kind of called Scotland's disruptor-in-chief, is that right, Scot? It was him that gave me the name. Is that what do you care about? And that, I'm not going to dodge the question about population because I'm the youngest of 13 children. So let's just move swiftly by that elephant. I was obviously the nice one. But that thing about, so you're waiting on someone, maybe when we met with Christiana Figueres, show off, a few months ago, she said, well, what are you waiting on? Who are you expecting to phone you and say, right, crack on now, you can now go. Just do it. I mean, literally, just do it. The Crown Estate is a perfect example. You are in a perfect space to collaborate and bring people together and chat about big ideas. So unless someone tells you to not do it, just do it. We're doing it. So that's fine.
Anyone else want to pick up the silos point, Louise?
I just wanted to pick up on the on just that question about, you know, one thing that we can do for everyone. Could I just say operate out of love and compassion in every engagement that you have? This is about hope. This is about, you know, this is about joy and love and compassion, and stop making about them and us. If only those people did that, we'd all be fine. This is about us. And I think in all of that, I just think, ask yourself what would happen if I threw more love at this situation.
And does the tricky question around population growth, Naomi?
We'll try and
What's
answer something. This conversation comes up a lot, and I think it's poignant for young people to be talking about it, especially because we are looking at, you know, maybe starting a family potentially. And of course, this is a question, and people say over and over again, the lowest carbon thing that you could do in your life is to not have a child. So, I mean, that's a pretty big decision to be faced with when you're in your 20s and 30s. I would, however, come back at that and say, we cannot really control population growth in a compassionate way. What we can control is consumption growth. And that fundamentally, I think, is the greater problem, is that people there are a lot of people, but everybody is consuming more than that person's allowance, if you like. And I don't know the statistics off the top of my head, but I read this week somewhere that just takeaway culture as a thing is set to increase, I think off the top of my head, it's about 1/3 in the next 4 or 5 years. So just think to yourself, have you had a takeaway coffee this week? Have you had a takeaway sandwich? Have you had something as you're traveling on a train, running through a station? Have you? Because there's so many resources and so much oil and so much energy used in producing that takeaway item that is immediately disposed of and then becomes instant waste that we cannot recycle and we cannot reuse. So I would argue that maybe we're looking at problems in slightly the wrong way, and we're focusing on how do we get rid of people and how do we get rid of the problem. Well, let's think about what the solutions are to something that seems so simple and so pragmatic, but yet we're just ignoring it every single day. And every single day you can walk down Princes Street or walk through Waverley Station, and 1 in 3 people have got a takeaway item in their hand? Like, let's think about that as a problem rather than focusing on population and people in terms of numbers first.
Thank you very much. That actually reminds me a little bit. I was working in government at the time of the first Climate Change Act and working in that area. And one of the things we instigated was a climate change behaviours research programme to actually understand the need to change the way in which we live our lives. And I remember when we were trying to think about one of the changes that were required, at one point we had buy less stuff, because actually buy less stuff actually could have been quite powerful, and you can understand some of the complexities around that, but consumption is a really important thing for us to think about. I'm afraid we have run out of time, but if people haven't had a chance to ask a question, if you'd like to write them down and leave them at reception, we can't promise we'll have every one of them answered, but we'll try and get back to people. We'll also have some time for conversation later, but for now I'm going to hand over to Sarah Skerritt from Scotland's Rural College and a representative of the Scottish Consortium for Rural Research to give the vote of thanks.
Thank you very much. So I'm wearing 2 hats this evening, from Scotland's Rural College and the Scientific Director of the Scottish Consortium for Rural Research, and I'm delighted that we're co-hosting this event this evening. In the billing, this is 10 minutes, but I'm going to try and keep it to 3 in the interest of us all getting to the reception and having conversations and some action. So the strapline of the RSE is knowledge made useful, and I think we've digested a lot of knowledge this evening, and the call to arms is to make that useful. I just want to go back to the fact that this is the Peter Wilson lecture, and casting our minds back, this is the 16th of those, and that I was looking up on my phone, I was tweeting, but I did Google for a moment when he was actually at the East of Scotland College of Agriculture, and it was from 1984 to 1990 when he was principal, and I joined in 1988, I think, so I did have the pleasure of being there when he was there. And the theme that I'm going to draw out from this evening, from all of you, is about connectedness and the expansion that connectedness brings. And he was certainly a visionary who saw what connectedness and bringing people and institutions together could bring that working in silos alone could not achieve. So firstly, Francesca, you said we're standing on the shoulders of giants, but we must act by 2030, otherwise you outlined a dystopia of pollution, disease, no birdsong, and deserted villages in the space of geological seconds, and called us to arms. You talked of knowledge and ingenuity and speaking with one voice. And you talked of connections, both looking backwards in the present, so horizontally, and looking forwards. Connections and unintended consequences, how all of our land use must be connected in order to provide multiple benefits, and how we must be connected to nature rather than being unconnected to the nature that is out there. You used a phrase of bifocal and not myopic, and that's been retweeted quite a bit already. You talked of empathy, care, and stewardship. You also talked of trusting people, of connecting to people who you perhaps wouldn't otherwise trust normally. And citizen science and young people were particular categories that you encouraged us to bring into the fold. So the theme of connection coming through very strongly. And I was thinking of summing up, I was thinking, oh, I hope it continues because I'm onto something here. And it did through the panel. You've brought together a diverse set of people and representatives of different types of organisations onto the panel, again creating connections. And you all talked about connecting and working together through optimism, understanding and enacting solutions. One of you said these are society's targets which require action from every one of us. Another of you said we must link crises, we must link them together. Biodiversity and climate change, they are being linked, we must link them. We must challenge ourselves over different land uses, show leadership and ideas on how those link together, and join up our ways of thinking. So not only linking people, institutions, but maybe the synapses in our head, reroute how we even think. Because challenges and solutions are interrelated. They're not fragmented and siloed. So again, the issues themselves are not fragmented and siloed. And we were challenged to have an agreement on this day, the 30th of May 2019, in the RSE, that there is no such thing as fragmentation. And we have to work together. So I think we can raise a glass to that over conversations and collaborations and turn those into action. We saw one action tonight, which I did tweet about, thought was bloody brilliant, sorry. When Colin, you gave your seat to Naomi and now you're together, there's something in action. And I think we should just end on the connection around love and compassion. I was going to say, let's go and do some of that, but that might be inappropriate. But let's continue the conversations moving towards action over the reception. So thank you all very much for a stimulating evening. Thank you.
So there is a challenge ahead, but there is hope. We are not powerless. So collective action, collaboration, sharing power gives us collective power. So let's end with the question that Francesca asked us and that was repeated by a colleague from Glasgow University. Ask not what nature can do for you, but what you can do for nature. Please do join us upstairs, but let me again thank our speaker, Francesca, thank our panellists, Louise, Martin, Mike, Naomi and Colin, and thank you all for coming.